Christos voskres, Christos voskres. Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen. This is Father Basil Malovany again, doing another podcast. And I'm trying this live version again today, just to test it out. And people can listen to me live instead of the recording, but it still will be recorded. So today, just wanted to talk a little bit about the evangelists, especially Saint Mark, the evangelist, whose feast day is today, April 25th. And when we think about the gospel writers, you know who they are: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And they were all, of course, either actual disciples of Jesus or disciples of the followers of Jesus. And they, their writings were not just hearsay from other people. Their writings were actually their experiences of either being with Jesus, traveling with him for the 3 years, or traveling with Jesus's disciples, and evangelizing themselves. So you have to remember that about the gospel writers. They weren't just, like storytellers in that they heard these stories and then wrote them down. They actually experienced the evangelization and the spreading of the gospel message when they walked throughout the different cities of the Roman Empire. And most of them, of course, were martyred for the faith. Most of the disciples were killed because of the spreading of the good news of Jesus Christ. So, when we look at the example of the lives of these gospel writers, Mark is the first gospel that Matthew and Luke used to write their gospels as well. And also they shared their common stories, common experiences. And I remember always learning in my theology classes that Mark was actually written for, Roman citizens, not so much for the Jewish population, but for the pagans, the Gentiles, those people who did not really understand the Jewish tradition, who didn't understand the Jewish faith, but still were interested in the life of Jesus, so interested in learning about, what Jesus did in those 3 years of his journey with his apostles before his crucifixion. So that's basically what it was to the Gospel of Mark. And again, when we read these Gospels, we have to remember the historical situations that they were written in, And people always wonder, well, why are there some differences in the sources and the different stories in each gospel? Well, again, because, as I said earlier, all the gospel writers, experienced some of the either Jesus directly walking with him, or else were followers of his direct disciples. So Mark didn't actually follow Jesus. He wasn't actually a direct disciple of Jesus, but he was disciple of, some say Peter. He followed Peter for a while, and also Paul, and he went on many journeys with these apostles who, had more close contact with Jesus, had more of the direct contact. Of course, Peter, we know Peter is very much known in the Gospels as one of the main apostles, and had many examples of Peter being directly in the stories of Jesus here on earth. And how we read the Gospels, how we read those different stories, it depends again on what our goals are. So each of these Gospels are written for a different purpose. Each of them were written for a different cultural and ethnic group. Like I said, the Gospel of Mark was mostly written for the Gentiles, so it maybe doesn't have as many Jewish references as the other Gospels would, who were written more for the Gentile, or more for the Jewish people than the Gospel of Mark was. And that's maybe why it's a little shorter as well. It doesn't have as many long parables as the other Gospels do, but it's still very important, still a very important aspect of that spiritual journey that the apostles had with Jesus when they traveled through the earth with him around the Roman Empire. Um, you know, uh, so I guess my thought process here is, when we read these Gospels, again, we have to remember the historical aspect. We have to remember that each individual Gospel writer, where they came from, what their background was, and that's why there's a little bit maybe different aspects of each Gospel that differs a little bit from each other. And how are we going to use those Gospel passages? How are we going to use those words of Scripture to evangelize one another? We unfortunately, it would be beautiful if we could have Jesus here on earth again and follow him around like those disciples did, like those apostles, but we don't have the same direct experience following Jesus as these early Christians had. But we still have our own experiences in life where we could use the Scripture to help us in our everyday life situations. So we have to remember that the Scripture is timeless. It's not just written for the people of that era. It was written for everyone. It was written to show Jesus as the Son of God, and his journeys here on earth, and his, of course, passion, crucifixion, resurrection on the third day. All those aspects of Jesus's life are so very important for our faith journey. And when we read these Gospels, when we read these interesting facts and interesting stories about Jesus's life, and also about the people who followed him, his disciples, his apostles, we're gonna think to ourselves, well, when a situation comes in my life, how am I gonna use my knowledge of the gospel story? How am I gonna use the knowledge of what Jesus did on this earth, or what his apostles did when they followed Jesus, to overcome certain situations in my own life? How am I going to, um, make sure that I am uh, being uh, forgiving, that I'm being loving, that I'm being compassionate to one another? Because there's many, many examples in these stories that we read about that. Jesus is basically training his disciples throughout his 3-year journey to be the best Christians they could be. Okay, so that's basically all I want to talk about today. God bless you. Have a good day.